but today our focus is exclusively on strategic account planning. So let's start with maybe an insight. For many organizations, and I'd be interested as well, you can pop some comments in the chat as we as you listen to this, right? For many organizations, there's a big chunk of revenue that comes from just a small percentage of their customers. So if that is the case, then losing some of these key strategic oops, just pop yourself on mute, please, if you don't mind. Oops. Losing some of these key strategic customers can have far-reaching implications, specifically the loss of existing revenue, future revenue, market share, even losing people as well as a result of losing these relationships, and the increased likelihood, of course, of competitor encroachment. Now, this is probably even more important given the economic backdrop that we have at the moment, making sure that what we actually do is we treat these key strategic relationships as business assets. And fundamentally, what it is we need to do with these business assets, these key relationships, is protect and grow, because it is 6 times more expensive to get them back, to get an unhappy customer back, than it is to keep a satisfied one. And the key thing for us is really helping businesses making strategic account planning a competitive advantage for the business. So as I mentioned at the start, there are 3 parts of this. It's a big topic. It's a very big topic. We want to give you as much as we possibly can, not just about the what you need to do, but also about the how you need to go about it as well. So in part 1, which is today, we're going to talk about the business rationale all the way through to how you select the accounts for which you're going to consider as key strategic accounts, remembering that we have finite resources. And so it's really a case of how do we allocate those resources best to get the best return on investment for that. In part 2, we go deeper. We're going to go deeper into the actual implementation of the account planning process itself. We'll also talk about the frameworks to use and how you set the team up. And then in part 3, it's going to be all about executing successful account planning meetings. Forgive me, there's a ringing in my ear every time everybody joins, so I just got a little bit distracted. Specifically today, the things we're going to talk about is some research that sits behind what's going on at the moment in the world of sales and some of the issues that is creating. And then we're going to talk about how strategic account planning is going to help us overcome some of these challenges. And we'll also talk about a recent client study, a client that we've been working with for the last 18 months, and show you some of the results that they achieved and actually how they went about, how they achieved those. Where we want to land at the end is to give you some guidance on how to select accounts. And for those people that have turned up today as well, we will email you afterwards with a couple of things. One is the white paper that accompanies this, but also a tool to help you with account selection as well. So we'll send that to you probably tomorrow. Good, okay. Pause for a little breath. Let me just see the chat. Okay. Okay, so here's a question I have, and I would like everybody, if you don't mind, just to pop your answer in the chat. Very often, and if you haven't heard this before, maybe you're hearing this for the first time now, sales is described as a combination of art and science. In the chat for me, what I'd love you to do, is just tell me, what do you think about this question? Is it art? Is it science? Is it a combination? Tell me in the chat what you think it is. So Siddharth says a bit of both. It's a combination, more art than science. Very nice, that from Subhan. Sunil says combination. Okay, so I think everybody, 50-50, okay. So I would agree. It definitely is a combination of the two. But let's just wrap a little bit more sort of language around this into a bit more pragmatic language. When we talk about art specifically, well, and this list is not definitive, by the way, art is more the skill side, right? The tactics, questioning, value articulation, and we could continue.
Sorry, Mark, I accidentally muted you. Sorry. You need to unmute, Mark.
Okay, not sure where I got up to there, but I got accidentally muted. So let me just start again. So the art side is the skills, the tactics, the questioning, how we do the stuff that's typically in front of the customer. The science side of it is process, strategy, frameworks, systematization. Now, from a process point of view, it's not a case of process for process sake. We see process as a bridge between behaviors. So in a sales organization, people behave the way they do. The question is, if they were to behave, if their behaviors were more in line with sales success, the process is the bridge between the two. But today, the focus with account planning is definitely on the science side, because strategic account planning is a business process. So another question I would just like your answer to. Normally this is a rhetorical question, but I would really like your views on this. Can you continue to think and act in the same way and continue to get the results you need? Just pop a yes or no in the chat. I'd love to hear what you think about this question. And I think most people, yeah, okay, most people are saying no. And look, the world is changing.
Why?
Let me just pop this lady on mute. Okay. So the world is changing. Buyers are changing, and I want to dip into a bit of research now and talk about just exactly what's happening with buyers in terms of the challenges that we're facing. Because for sure, even if you take COVID out of the equation, for a very long time, buyer preferences have been shifted. And I can't emphasize enough just how important the strategic account planning process is to help you overcome some of these key challenges. So let's talk about some research. Now, the research comes from Korn Ferry. It's been around for quite a few years. This research has been updated in 2021. But here's what's happening. Buyers are reaching out to sellers later in their buying process. And what the research tells us, that roughly 79% of buyers wait until they fully identified their needs before they reach out to salespeople. 57% of buyers identify solutions first before they reach out to buyers. And 68% of buyers say that when they have experiences with salespeople, they either meet or exceed expectations. Now, on that particular point, that doesn't sound necessarily too bad. However, if we're just meeting expectations, then we get lost in a sea of sameness. There is no differentiation. And that's one of the real issues that I think salespeople are facing today. And this is further emphasized with the fact that same research, when buyers look for answers to problems, all of the possible resources that they could possibly reach out to, salespeople are 9 of 10. And so this is having a real impact on performance, and we'll talk about performance in just a moment. It's creating something called an apathy loop. And this is where buyers just see low value in engaging sellers earlier in the buying process, which, as I mentioned, hinders differentiation. So it looks like this. So buyers are saying when they identify an issue, they're just not calling salespeople first. As a consequence, they reach out later in the buying process. As they engage later in the buying process, this inhibits the salesperson's ability to be able to create differentiation. So maybe it's responding to an RFP, and it's only the RFP response that is the opportunity to create differentiation. Less meaningful differentiation means that they reach out to buyers later in the buying process, and around the apathy loop we go again. Now, there are some real and important implications for this. And I've got a list of 10 here, so I'm just going to go through the 10. But this is how this is affecting sellers as we see it today. So it's creating restrictions on when we can engage and influence the key decision makers. And in fact, some of these decision makers are just not even accessible, because we end up trying to access the client later in the buying process, and it's become quite formalized. So the buying process matures without our ability to influence it, and we end up with limited information about the context and the buying situation. Sometimes that might just be the context, the content that we have in the RFP itself. So it therefore becomes harder to create meaningful differentiation, and the buying decisions themselves, they become more product centered. And when they become more product centered, there's more of a focus then on price. And we hear all the time from salespeople that, you know, buyers just make decisions based on price. And to an extent that's true, but to an extent that's also solvable if we're able to get to some of the decision makers somewhat earlier. As a consequence of too much focus on pricing and those pricing shootouts, our margins get compressed, the likelihood of winning is reduced. Sellers just become convinced that the only way to sell is to respond to the RFP itself. And when the RFP is actually just one step in the customer's buying process that we should be trying to get to earlier if we can. And because we get continued to get called into the buying process later, what happens is we just don't win as many deals, and we spend more resources pursuing opportunities with a low win probability. Now, sounds may be a little bit damning. In fact, let me just ask, first of all, I want to ask a question here. Does this resonate with the experiences that you have in your selling situations? Again, just put me a yes or no in the chat. So Suban's saying yes. Ruga's saying yes. Okay, Gail's saying yes. Okay, very good. Hey, Gail, nice to see you. It's been a while. Okay, pretty often. Okay, so what's happening to you, this research is reflecting, which is a good thing that's the case, but it's not a good thing that it's happening. So it's solvable. The good news is it's solvable. What's been happening though, and this has been going on now for about 5 or 6 years, same research has been showing that sales performance has been in decline. And in 2021, 53% of salespeople either met or exceeded their targets, and that's been going down. That's a backward downward trend. And so the question is, how do we solve it? Part of the solution to that is how we organize ourselves around our sales system. And let's talk about that now, your sales system. And as we talk about this, we'll then start to focus on key account planning or strategic account planning. So first of all, everybody has a sales system. Doesn't matter how big your organization is, whether it's a small organization or a big, large multinational, every organization has a sales system. And there is huge potential growth in what you do within your sales system itself. So there are 4 key elements. These are the customer management activities. So I'm sure this language is familiar to you, right? So demand generation. So we need to generate demand. Now, whether that comes from existing or new sources, we need to continue to generate demand for our products and services. Otherwise, we won't have any opportunities to manage. So opportunity management is the pursuit. Now, at the same time, we also need to engage with clients as well. And below the line, what we're constantly doing there is qualifying and pursuing. Qualifying the opportunity to make sure that when we're hopefully pursuing something, we have a higher probability of winning. And then we pursue, obviously, and many of the opportunities we pursue nowadays are complex, multiple decision makers. Above the line, and this is where we're going to focus on today, is the relationship management part. So, and the way we manage relationships is through our strategic account planning. And the purpose of our relationship management or strategic account management process is to protect and grow. And actually, the reality is there's no such thing as protecting. It's only growth. It's only growth. That's how we protect accounts or protect relationships. And there is the potential for accelerated performance as you begin to optimize these 4 key areas that surround the customer at the center. So let's focus on above the line then, right? Let's talk about strategic account management. Specifically, what I want to start with is, what are the 3 key business objectives of strategic account management? So I'm going to launch a poll now. Let me try and do this. And I'm going to give you 4 options. You can choose more than one option. So I want you to just let me know what you think the objectives are of strategic account planning. Can you see the poll? Somebody give you a thumbs up. Mr. Pumaram, I can see you too. All right, good. So the question's not necessarily a difficult one. So I can see about 70% of people responded. Very good. Just give it a couple more seconds. Okay, let me end the poll and share the results. Good. So I made the question relatively simple, and fairly obvious. So the 3 that you chose, that's the 3 that we'll focus on now. So let's go through the 3 key objectives of what a strategic account planning process should achieve for you. So first one, it should create meaningful, recognized differentiation. So meaningful and recognized, meaningful meaning it means something to the customer, and recognized that they see it and they acknowledge it. Now, how do we do this? Well, we do this by deepening existing relationships and broaden the connectivity across the account. That can take a little bit of strategic thinking about how we do that and who we target. We need to be recognized also for the value add that we bring. There's a little bit of mindset in this as well, in the sense that bringing value add, that's potentially a bit of investment on our side, either psychologically or actually. We want to elevate the perceptions, and this is so key, because as we start to elevate their perceptions of us, then we strengthen advocacy. And I would say, when I look at client opportunities, as I do regularly, when I look at client opportunities, what happens, let me just stop showing the poll, sorry. There we go. What happens is, the later people are engaging with in the buying process, the lower the advocacy tends to be for their particular solution. Then what we want to be able to do is identify opportunities earlier, and in order to do that, what we need to do is we need to understand, so what's going on in their world? What are the trends and events that shape their prioritization, their decision making? How do we understand the business issues that you have the capabilities to solve? We want to identify those. That's then going to enable us to sell proactively, as opposed to reactively waiting for that RFP to land. And then the third one is, how do we get out in front of the buying process? And again, if we go back to the fact that 79% of buyers wait until they've fully identified needs before they reach out to sellers, 57% identify solutions first. What we want to be able to do is get out in front of all of that, so that how do we become aware of those opportunities, right? Engage decision makers earlier, cast that wider net, drive advocacy, and influence the buying process, so that we can communicate and also demonstrate what is our real differentiation. So how do we do that? We need to get more strategic in the way we operate, and the strategy is all. The strategic thinking is all part of the process that we need to implement. The question that sits behind the strategy is just, how much do we want to influence how the account stakeholders perceive us, because that influences the way they treat you. So we have a relationship status scale, which you can see, which goes from vendor all the way up to strategic partner. 5 levels. Now, there's no right or wrong here. as a business, you can exist on any of these levels, and you will exist on these levels, I'm sure, with different clients. But what's important is that, first of all, your current position with a client from a strategic point of view is always going to be a starting point. What we need to do is measure how they see us, because their perception of us is always going to be our reality. How we think they see us doesn't matter. How they see us, whether that's as a vendor, deal with us transactionally, all the way up to a strategic partner or a trusted partner, where there's much more of a partnership ethic, then there's a huge difference. Sorry, I just got my attention caught there. So their current perception is our reality. Strategically, what we want to do is target where you want their perception to move to. And there's a system that sits behind that, and that system is all part of the strategy. And so that's the key, right? Is figuring out where you currently are, and then asking yourself the question: how much do you really want to influence or have an influence over how they see us and influence this particular shift? Now, when we do this, there are some key commercial advantages to this. The way we are treated changes. It's more partnership orientated, but the commercial advantages, first of all, 3 of them: you are differentiated in their eyes. And what does that actually mean? Well, it means the influence of competition is diminished. And so this increases our probability of sales success. The importance of your solution features diminishes. Now, just if you're trying to create differentiation at the product or solution level, that's a really difficult battle to fight, because solutions and products are easily replicated, and the way we really want to create differentiation is through us as individuals and the way we engage. As we start to move up those relationship levels, price sensitivity diminishes as well, as you become more about the way you engage. You bring more to the party than just your product, service, and solution. So first commercial outcome, you become differentiated as far as they're concerned. The second one is relationships are broader and deeper. So you develop stronger advocacy. You hear about opportunities earlier. You have access to key decision makers, giving you more information, giving you more understanding about where their particular buying thinking started or originated from. And this ultimately manifests itself in changes in business results. And I'm going to give you an example of how this happened very recently in a moment. But essentially, what we see happening is that when we implement strategic account planning, revenue per account increases. Cost of pursuing opportunities goes down, and there is a more win-win approach between you and the customer, and there's more opportunities for you to grow together. And so there is a real and material commercial advantage to actually doing this. You wouldn't want to do this just for the sake of it. This is all about how does it help us improve and grow our business. Now, to give you an example, I've changed the name of the organization here, just obviously for commercial sensitivities, but this is a large European semiconductors manufacturer. And we've been working with them for the last 18 months. So let me just give you the background. They're based, this particular part of their business is based in China. They have 4 major sort of quasi-government organizations that provide 95% of their revenue. They had been losing some serious ground to competition, lost opportunities that they really should never have lost. What turned out was, as we started to look a little bit deeper, is there was just a basic lack of understanding of the client. There wasn't enough knowledge, there wasn't enough research done amongst the account management team. And so as we implemented the strategic account planning process, they started to get much more intentional about how they started to shift perceptions. So here's what happened. They had better visibility, more data, more information to work within the accounts. And this feeds off itself, right? They had a deeper understanding of the issues, the priorities, the challenges, and the needs of their customer. and the shifts in those, clients actually started commenting really quickly about a different approach that they had seen from them. And so that feedback started to become more commonplace. And as a consequence, relationships started to change. The way they were being treated started to change. And it happened much quicker than we ever thought it would, to be fair. What they then did is they started to figure out, well, we need to make some investments into these relationships. And so they created a new customer fulfillment role. But most importantly, what happened was revenue tripled across these accounts. You can see the numbers on the screen there. And they secured 2 long-term arrangements. You can see the numbers there as well. The important thing to note here as well is this is not just about what happened this year. This is about the ongoing return that is going to happen for these guys as they continue thinking more strategically with their strategic account planning process. So, as I mentioned at the start, this is a business process. But it's not rocket science. Nothing about this is at all complex, but it does require a bit of systematization. So I want to give you an overview of the business process itself. We focus on most of this in the next webinar, but the first step and an important step is account selection. So resources are finite. We need to figure out where do we apply the resources that we have for the best RORI. Now, I'll dip into this in a bit more detail in just a moment, but it stands for return on relationship investment. So selection is first. That's why we are going to go up to selection today in this particular webinar. But then what happens after that is we need to create or update the strategic account plan. SAP is strategic account plan. And that involves a bunch of different things, right? So meetings with internal and external stakeholders. It involves mapping out all of the people on the account side, figuring out who's who in the zoo, and then figuring out how do what is the strategy? What do we actually need to do? Where are we in terms of their perception of us? From there on, it's about execution. And the more coordinated and more collaborative we can be within the organization, the better the outcome for sure. There's one thing that we teach, which is called a statement of relationship intent, which is a co-created statement where you sit with the client, having engineered some of this first of all, but you define what that relationship is going to look like over a period of time, forward-looking. And then you become strategic in your targeting of specific key stakeholders in terms of how do we move their perception forward. So you get hyper-targeted, hyper-focused, and you start one person at a time, shifting perceptions, identifying where they are in terms of their relationship status, and then figuring out how you can do that. Now, that's all part of putting the strategy together and executing the strategy. Where Liberty, obviously not their real name, but where Liberty were successful was not only in the implementation of the framework, but it was also the cadence that they wrapped around it. It was the reviews that they consistently had with both internally and externally. And whilst none of this is rocket science, as I mentioned, very little of this happens that often in businesses that we often start to deal with, which is often why we're called in. So it's a process, right? It's a process, it's strategy. But the first step, as I mentioned, is how do you select your strategic accounts? Now, as I mentioned at the start, we're going to send you a tool that's going to help you do this. But a huge part of this process is who do we want to focus on, given the limited resources that we have, to be able to make sure that we as a business get the best return on investment time. So we have a 4-step framework for you, which has 3 core metrics, and I'm going to talk you through these core metrics. And again, I would assert, or I would advise, that we should be tracking these metrics continually across our core relationships. So here we go. So return on relationship investment. How you do this we want, if we can, we want a historic view and we want a forecast view, a forward-looking view and a backward-looking view. What's the revenue on the account? So historic, forecast. What's the cost of managing the account? And that includes salaries and investments and anything that goes into running that account. What's the margin? And that's your metric. And again, running accounts like a small business with the P&L is amazing. It's amazing how many organizations we see where they've got relationships that are just totally underwater, completely unprofitable. But for some reason, they've got to keep them for whatever particular reason that is. Now, the more accurate the data you have, obviously, the more accurate the metric is going to be. And I'm not necessarily prescribing that you have to use all of these metrics. And where you don't have the information you need, that's part of the strategy. The task is to go out and get that information. When we send this to you, it'll look a little bit like this, and we'll send this on to you tomorrow. So the first one is return on relationship investment. Now, the second metric that we want you to look at then is growth potential. And this is basically a measurement of share of wallet. So what's the historic share of wallet, which is basically how much they spend on products and services like yours, how much they're spending, that in total, how much they spend on yours with you, and then try and identify trends either historic or going forward. Keeping a measure then on what your share of wallet is, if you can get this information, is another key metric, because you're going to give yourself an idea of what is the real growth potential here. I mean, if you're 5% of what they spend, there's potentially something to go at. If you're 98% of what they spend, then obviously there's less growth potential. And then the final of the three metrics is relationship potential. And for this, again, we go back to the relationship status table that we talked about earlier on. And it all comes down to how they perceive us. And so what we want to do here is over 3 time periods. So historic, from whenever, it doesn't really matter, now and forward looking. How do they perceive us? How do they perceive the competition? And just by measuring this, we can get a sense of where they see us and where we can move to, and also what we're facing, what we're up against in terms of how they perceive the competition. So 3 steps: calculate your return on relationship investment, your growth potential, and then your relationship potential. And then the fourth step is just analyzing the data. And what we'll do is we'll give you a couple of questions to answer in terms of what trends you identify, and then you make your own determination from what you come up with and the analysis in terms of which account you decide you want to classify as your strategic account, and then wrap the strategy around. Okay. Final thoughts. I'd like to get your final thoughts, actually. So I'm going to launch another poll, and I'd just be interested in your response to this particular question, and then I'm going to open this up for questioning from everyone. So, okay, here we go. Can everybody see this? So, which of these statements best describes your, yeah, thanks, Fraser. Which of these statements best describe your current approach to account planning? Let us know. So we've got about 50 people in the rooms, so we're about halfway through. I mean, just let it run for a minute or two. Sorry, I just need to cough. And we've got about 31 people, so I'm going to give it maybe another 10 seconds. Still people answering. Okay, let me just end that and launch the results. So interesting. Yeah, makes just makes for interesting reading. Okay, let's just wrap up, and then because I want to leave some time open for you guys to ask questions. So here's my final thoughts on the matter. The game is advancing customer perceptions. That's the game, and to do that, we just have to be more strategic and more targeted and more focused in terms of how we go about doing it. There's huge growth potential, and we've seen this so many times within the sales system that you operate. And in terms of those, in terms of those 4 customer management areas, again, we've seen businesses who are focused just on one of those 4 areas that has created significant growth in their business. I think there's actually some of the customers, some of our clients are here today who've experienced this. So the first step is account selection. That's the bit that we've talked about today. We know that resources are limited. In the next and upcoming webinar in part 2, what we're going to spend some time talking about is the framework itself, so the strategic framework. Also, how you put the account team together, and then the cadence to make it successful. At this point, I'm going to take a pause, and I would be very interested to hear your questions and feedback